Imagine you survive. The war is over. The silence has returned, and now you must live in what the war left behind. Most people, when they imagine this scenario, stop at the survival. They never think about the inheritance. There is a particular fantasy embedded in the human imagination about catastrophe. It is the fantasy of the clean slate. The idea that if enough is destroyed, what remains will be simplified, purified. That the survivors of a great catastrophe inherit not a ruined world but a blank one, difficult, yes, but legible. A world that can be rebuilt from first principles by people who are still whole. This fantasy is wrong. It has always been wrong. And in the specific case of a third world war involving the weapons that currently exist, it is not merely wrong but dangerous, because it allows the imagination to stop at the moment of survival rather than continuing into the decades that follow it, where the real reckoning occurs. The bombs are not this story. The bombs are the beginning of the story. What comes after is what this is about. To understand what a third world war would actually produce, you first have to understand what it would not produce. It would not produce a single definitive moment of ending. Wars do not end like that. And nuclear wars, if the historical modeling and the physics of what nuclear weapons actually do are taken seriously, would, and even less cleanly than conventional ones, there would not be a moment when the last missile lands and the silence returns, and the survivors emerge into a ruined but stable landscape. The effects of a nuclear exchange extend outward in time and space in ways that the initial explosions do not capture. The blast radius of a warhead is measured in kilometers. The consequences of a nuclear exchange are measured in decades, and they affect not just the combatant nations, but the entire planetary system. This is not speculation, it is physics. And the physics have been understood in their broad outlines since the 1980s. The mechanism is called nuclear winter. When a nuclear warhead detonates over a city, and cities are the primary targets in any serious nuclear exchange, because cities are where industry, infrastructure, and population are concentrated, it ignites fires. Not small fires, firestorms. The thermal pulse from a single large warhead ignites everything combustible within a radius of many kilometers simultaneously. Wood, paper, fuel, fabric, the organic material in human bodies. The fires coalesce and generate their own weather systems, pulling in oxygen from the surrounding area and driving superheated combustion gases upward into the atmosphere at velocities that carry the particulate matter, the soot, the ash, the incompletely combusted carbon above the troposphere, above the weather systems that would normally wash it out and into the stratosphere. In the stratosphere, there is no rain. There is no mechanism to remove the particles. They spread, driven by high-altitude winds, across the hemisphere, across the planet. They block sunlight. The models vary in their specific predictions, but the general structure of the outcome is consistent across the scientific literature. A large-scale nuclear exchange involving perhaps a few hundred warheads, a fraction of the current global arsenal, would inject enough soot into the stratosphere to reduce surface sunlight by 20 to 40% for a period of years. Global average temperatures would drop by several degrees Celsius. The growing season in temperate agricultural regions, the regions that produce the majority of the world's food, would shorten dramatically, in some scenarios by months. In some regions, it would not exist at all for 1 or more years. This is the inheritance, not the blast. Not the radiation, the cold, the dark, the years without summer that follow the minutes of fire. Let us be specific about the arithmetic of survival, because the arithmetic matters. The current global population is approximately 8 billion people. That population is fed by an agricultural system that operates, as we have examined before, with very little redundancy. The just-in-time supply chains, the fossil fuel inputs, the concentrated genetic diversity of high-yield crop varieties, all of it is calibrated for a climate envelope that has remained relatively stable throughout the entire history of agriculture. A nuclear winter disrupts that envelope globally, simultaneously, for every agricultural region on Earth at the same time. There are no unaffected regions to draw surplus from. There is no functioning international logistics system to redistribute what surplus exists. There are no fuel supplies to power the mechanized agriculture that modern yields depend on, because the refining and distribution infrastructure for fossil fuels is itself concentrated in exactly the kinds of industrial facilities that are primary targets in a nuclear exchange. Studies conducted by atmospheric scientists and food security researchers have modeled the agricultural collapse that would follow a nuclear winter of moderate severity, not a full-scale exchange of all existing warheads, but a regional nuclear war involving perhaps 100 warheads between two nuclear-armed states. The results are consistent. Global food production would fall by somewhere between 20 and 50% within the first 2 years. In the most affected regions, the collapse would be near total. The global population that cannot be fed by a food system operating at 50% capacity is not 50% of 8 billion. It is more than that, because the distribution of food collapse is uneven, because the logistics required to move food from surplus regions to deficit regions would themselves be impaired, and because the social and political structures required to coordinate that redistribution would be under severe stress from every other consequence of the conflict simultaneously. The demographers and food security analysts who have studied this do not all agree on exact numbers. The uncertainty in the models is genuine, but the range of estimates for excess mortality from famine alone, not from the initial exchange, not from radiation, not from the collapse of medical infrastructure, but purely from agricultural failure, runs into the billions over the course of a decade following a large-scale nuclear exchange. The bombs kill millions. What follows kills billions. This is not rhetoric. It is the output of peer-reviewed atmospheric modeling and food security analysis. It is the inheritance. But let us say you survive. Let us say you are among the fraction of the global population that is not killed by the initial exchange, not killed by the fires, not killed by the acute radiation exposure in the zones downwind of ground zeros, not killed by the famine that follows the nuclear winter, not killed by the diseases that propagate through populations whose immune systems have been compromised by radiation exposure and malnutrition, not killed by the collapse of medical infrastructure that would have treated the injuries and illnesses that in normal times are survivable. Let us say you are alive 10 years after the exchange. You are somewhere that was not directly targeted. You have found food, found water, found shelter. You have survived the worst of the nuclear winter. The skies are beginning to clear. The temperatures are beginning to recover. The silence that followed the war has settled into something more permanent. What do you inherit? You inherit a world without functioning institutions. The nation-states that organized human life before the war, that maintained the legal frameworks, the property rights, the currency systems, the rule of law, the monopoly on legitimate violence that prevented ordinary human conflict from cascading into chronic warfare, Those structures have been catastrophically damaged or destroyed. Not everywhere, not uniformly, but at the scale required for them to function. A government that cannot project authority beyond its immediate geographic vicinity is not a functioning government. A legal system that cannot be enforced is not a legal system. A currency that is not backed by a functional economy and a credible state is not a currency. In the aftermath of a large-scale nuclear exchange, the political geography of the world does not look like a map with borders and capitals. It looks like a collection of zones, some controlled by remnants of pre-war governmental structures, some controlled by military units that have maintained cohesion through the collapse, some controlled by whoever was organized enough and ruthless enough to secure a resource that others needed: water, fuel, farmland, medicine. This is not a hypothetical. It is what the historical record of societal collapse consistently shows. When central authority fails, the vacuum is filled not by the emergence of cooperative utopian communities, but by the logic of immediate survival, which is the logic of who has what and who can take it. The anthropological and historical literature on post-collapse societies is not optimistic about the speed with which cooperative governance reemerges. It takes generations. Sometimes it takes centuries. And it reemerges, when it does, in forms that bear little resemblance to what preceded the collapse. The survivors of a Third World War do not inherit a simplified version of the world they knew. They inherit the wreckage of it, along with the knowledge of what it was, which may be the cruelest part of the inheritance: to know what existed, to understand what has been lost, to possess in memory and in whatever physical remnants survive the outline of a civilization that no living person has the resources or the institutional capacity to reconstruct. You inherit a world of contaminated systems. Nuclear weapons, when they detonate, produce a range of radioactive isotopes with half-lives that span the entire spectrum from seconds to millennia. The immediate radiation exposure in the blast zones is lethal within defined radii. But the longer-term contamination is more insidious and more geographically extensive. Fallout, the radioactive particulate material dispersed by the explosion and carried downwind, contaminates soil, water, and agricultural land across areas many times larger than the blast zones themselves. The contamination of soil with long-lived isotopes cesium-137, strontium-90, plutonium-239 renders agricultural land unusable for periods ranging from decades to centuries, depending on the specific isotopes present, the soil composition, and the degree of initial deposition. In a post-nuclear landscape, the maps that survivors draw of habitable and cultivable land are not the maps that existed before the war. Large regions that were previously productive agricultural territory become exclusion zones, not because they are physically destroyed, but because the invisible contamination of their soil makes the food grown in them a slow death sentence. Water sources in and downwind of contaminated regions carry the same burden. Rivers that drain contaminated watersheds carry radioactive material downstream. Aquifers that receive recharge from contaminated surface water become compromised over time. The infrastructure required to test water for contamination, the laboratories, the instruments, the trained personnel, the supply chains for reagents, is itself a casualty of the collapse. In the absence of that infrastructure, survivors cannot know with confidence whether the water they drink is safe. They drink it anyway because the alternative is immediate death from dehydration rather than eventual death from radiation exposure. This is what it means to make decisions under the conditions of the inheritance. You inherit a world without the knowledge infrastructure that made the previous world function. This point is perhaps the least intuitive, but among the most consequential. Modern civilization does not run on physical infrastructure alone. It runs on accumulated, specialized, institutionally organized knowledge, the expertise of the engineers who maintain the power grid, the professors, doctors who operate the hospitals, the agronomists who manage the soil chemistry of industrial farms, the pharmacists who synthesize the medications that keep chronic diseases from becoming death sentences, the logistics coordinators who move goods through supply chains of continental scale. That knowledge is not stored in books that survivors can simply retrieve and apply. It is stored in people, in the trained, experienced practitioners of thousands of specialized disciplines, and in institutions that organize those people into functional systems. When the people die and the institutions collapse, the knowledge does not automatically transfer to whoever survives. The know-how required to restart an industrial civilization is not accessible to people who are simultaneously managing the immediate demands of survival in a resource-depleted, contaminated, institutionally broken landscape. The historical precedent is instructive. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century, the knowledge required to maintain Roman infrastructure, the engineering of aqueducts, the organization of agricultural production, the legal and administrative frameworks that coordinated economic activity across a continental system did not transfer smoothly to the successor societies. It fragmented, degraded, and in many cases disappeared entirely. The population of Rome, which had been sustained by an imperial supply system, collapsed from perhaps 1 million people at the height of the empire to perhaps 20,000 within a few centuries of the collapse. The aqueducts that had supplied the city fell into disrepair, not because the technology was forgotten in any absolute sense, but because the institutional capacity to maintain them, the organized labor, the administrative coordination, the economic system that paid for it, ceased to exist. The survivors of a Third World War would face this problem at global scale, compressed into a much shorter time frame. In a world whose complexity far exceeds that of the Roman Empire and whose knowledge infrastructure is correspondingly more specialized and more difficult to reconstruct from fragments, you inherit a world of permanent psychological damage at civilizational scale. This dimension of the inheritance is the hardest to quantify and perhaps the most important to understand. Human societies are not merely physical systems. They are psychological ones. They run on trust in institutions, trust in currency, trust in the social contract that makes cooperation possible between strangers, trust in the future. The expectation that the future exists, that it is worth investing in, that the decisions made today will have consequences in a world that will still be recognizable tomorrow. This expectation is the foundation of every complex social behavior, from education to agriculture to governance. A civilization-scale catastrophe does not merely damage physical infrastructure. It damages the psychological infrastructure that makes rebuilding possible. Trauma at the scale of a nuclear exchange, experienced not by individuals or communities, but by entire populations simultaneously, produces effects that psychological and sociological research consistently identifies as corrosive to exactly the capacities required for post-collapse recovery: the ability to cooperate with strangers, the ability to defer immediate gratification for long-term gain, the ability to invest in institutions whose benefits will not be felt for decades, the ability to trust. Post-traumatic responses in survivor populations following mass casualty events consistently include increased rates of violence, decreased social cohesion, shortened time horizons for decision-making, and heightened in-group versus out-group distinctions, precisely the psychological profile that makes the reconstruction of cooperative, complex, forward-looking civilization most difficult. The people who survive a nuclear exchange are not simply fewer in number. They are, in aggregate, psychologically shaped by their survival in ways that make the tasks of rebuilding harder rather than easier. This is the inheritance that no post-apocalyptic narrative adequately represents. It is not the ruins. It is what the ruins do to the people who have to live among them. Now step back from the specifics. Step back from the fallout maps and the caloric deficit calculations and the institutional collapse timelines. Step back from the contaminated water and the failed harvests and the expertise that dies with the experts. Look at the shape of the problem. A species develops over the course of a few centuries, a form of technology so destructive that its use at scale renders the civilization that developed it non-functional. The technology is not secret. It is not difficult to produce relative to the industrial capacity of a modern state. It is deployed by multiple actors simultaneously in a system, this system of nuclear deterrence, that is explicitly designed to prevent its use, but that has never in its 70-year history been shown to be immune to failure under sufficient pressure. The deterrence system works through the logic of mutual assured destruction. Each nuclear armed state refrains from initiating a nuclear exchange because the response would guarantee its own destruction. The logic is coherent. The logic has held, with some notable close calls, for 7 decades. But the logic of deterrence is not a physical law. It is a social construction. It depends on the rationality of decision-makers under conditions of extreme stress. It depends on the accuracy of information available to those decision-makers in moments of crisis. It depends on the functioning of command and control systems that are themselves complex and that have, in documented historical incidents, come closer to catastrophic failure than the public record has generally acknowledged. In 1983, a Soviet early warning satellite system falsely detected an incoming American nuclear strike. The officer on duty, Stanislav Petrov, decided unilaterally that the alert was a false alarm and did not report it up the chain of command. His reasoning was intuitive. The scale of the detected attack seemed too small to be real. He was right. The system had malfunctioned. But the decision not to report was his alone, made in minutes, under conditions of extraordinary pressure, with consequences that would have extended to every human being on Earth. In 1995, a Norwegian scientific rocket was briefly interpreted by Russian radar systems as a potential ballistic missile. Boris Yeltsin was presented with the nuclear briefcase, the authentication device for authorizing a nuclear strike, for the first time in his presidency. The alert was resolved before a launch decision was required. But the window between detection and the point at which a response would have needed to be initiated was measured in minutes. These are not classified incidents. They are part of the documented record, and they are not the only ones. The historical literature on nuclear close calls is extensive, and it consistently reveals a system that has survived not purely through the robustness of its design, but through a combination of design and luck luck is not a property that holds indefinitely across an unbounded number of trials. The Fermi paradox, in its most unsettling formulation, suggests that the silence of the universe may be the silence of civilizations that did not survive their own technology. The development of nuclear weapons is not unique to Earth. Any civilization that develops industrial technology that discovers nuclear physics, that pursues military applications of that physics, which is to say any civilization that follows the developmental trajectory we have followed, will arrive at the same threshold. A threshold at which the capability to destroy civilization is possessed by multiple actors, managed by a deterrence system whose stability is not guaranteed, and which generates, over time, an accumulating probability of catastrophic failure. The question the Fermi paradox poses in this context is not whether civilizations face this threshold. They do. It is whether any of them successfully cross it. Whether any civilization manages to develop and deploy civilization-ending weapons and then, through some combination of governance, wisdom, luck, and institutional design, survive long enough and develop enough to move beyond the period of maximum risk. We do not know the answer. We have no data point other than ourselves, and we have not yet crossed the threshold. We are in the middle of it. We have been in the middle of it since 1945. Every year that passes without a nuclear exchange is a year added to the streak, but a streak is not a guarantee. The probability of catastrophic failure in any given year is not zero, and the integral of a non-zero annual probability over a sufficiently long period approaches certainty. This is the mathematics of the inheritance, not the inheritance left by a war that has already happened. The inheritance we are accumulating for a war that has not happened yet. The slow, quiet, year-by-year accumulation of risk in a system that works until it doesn't, managed by institutions that are competent until they aren't, dependent on decision-makers who are rational until they aren't. There is a version of this story that ends with hope. It is the version in which the technological trajectory that produced nuclear weapons also produces the governance frameworks, the verification mechanisms, the trust-building institutions, and eventually the post-national structures required to manage the risk at the scale it actually exists, in which the same intelligence that split the atom also proves capable of the harder task, building a system of global governance robust enough to prevent the atom from being used. This version is not impossible. The arc of nuclear arms control since 1945 shows real progress in places. The test ban treaties, the non-proliferation treaty, the strategic arms reduction agreements between the United States and the Soviet Union and its successors. The number of nuclear warheads in the global arsenal peaked in the 1980s and has declined substantially since then. The framework exists. The intention, in many quarters, exists. But the framework is incomplete. The intention is uneven. The number of nuclear-armed states has grown since the Non-Proliferation Treaty was signed. The arms control architecture that survived the Cold War has been eroding steadily in the 21st century as treaties have been abandoned. Verification mechanisms weakened, and the geopolitical conditions that produced the original arms control agreements have shifted in ways that make their reconstruction difficult. We are not moving uniformly towards safety. We are moving in multiple directions simultaneously, in a system of sufficient complexity that no single actor controls the trajectory. If you survive, you inherit a world that is cold and dark and contaminated and broken and populated by traumatized people in collapsed institutions trying to reconstruct cooperative civilization without the knowledge infrastructure, the institutional memory, or the psychological wholeness required to do it quickly. If you do not survive, you leave behind nothing, no record, no warning, no signal that could reach another civilization and tell them what happened here. This is what the silence of the universe may mean. Not that intelligence is rare, not that the distances are too great. but that the civilizations that reach this threshold, this specific, predictable, almost mechanical point in the development of any industrial species, tend not to produce survivors capable of transmitting a signal. They produce a world their children inherit, and their children, struggling to find clean water in the ruins of what their parents built, do not have telescopes. The war has not happened. The weapons exist. The systems exist. The risk accumulates quietly, year by year, in the background of every other crisis that demands attention. And somewhere in the decision-making apparatus of every nuclear-armed state on Earth right now, there are people whose job it is to manage the gap between the world as it is and the world as it could become in 30 minutes. They are doing their best. That has always been true. It has not always been enough. The question is not whether humanity would survive a third world war. The question is what kind of species builds the weapons, keeps them for a century, and calls that survival.